Hi, my name is Pastor Jerry Bertelson, and I serve as the Senior Spiritual Care Consultant here at Good Samaritan National Campus in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And I'd like to share with you some common phrases that are said during times of grief that we think come from the Bible or come from the sacred texts of other faith traditions, but in fact, they don't. Things that you may have heard or things you may have read along the way that come from Scripture are things like everything happens for a reason, or God needed another angel, or God will never give you more than you can handle. These phrases, in fact, are not found in Scripture, and they're not found in the sacred writings of any faith tradition. Rather, the things that Scripture do have to say during times of grief are things that are not platitudes or phrases that we think might bring comfort, but in fact, they really don't. Rather, Scripture says things like, God is close to the brokenhearted and binds up the wounds of the afflicted. In other words, God doesn't run away from grief and sorrow and sadness, but rather God runs toward us in times of grief and sadness and sits with us in our hurt and in our brokenness. Scripture also tells us that grief is something that is natural and something that can be named. In fact, the shortest verse in all of the Bible are two words: Jesus wept, and he wept at the death of his friend named Lazarus. Grief is normal, it is natural, it is okay to feel whatever is being felt at the death of a loved one, at the circumstances that arise in life that bubble up all of those feelings that we call grief. Grief is normal and natural, and Scripture affirms that. And finally, Scripture reminds us that when we grieve, it's important to grieve with others. That grief is something that we shouldn't just do alone. Now, there are times when we need our alone time and we need our space during times of grief. But we grieve in community. As Scripture says, we ought to mourn with those who mourn. In other words, when another person is going through times of grief, it's helpful to let them know that they're not alone, that you're there to be a listening ear, to be a crying shoulder, to simply be a presence to them with no expectation other than simply being present, because we need each other during times of grief.